Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and in particular to join the distinguished panelists in this first session and beyond, and also to have the privilege of following a real hero of our time, Robert Morgenthau. I want to pay tribute. I want to pay tribute to his being in the trenches all these years, and particularly with respect more laterally to Iran. My basic thesis today is that if war is a continuation of diplomacy by other means, then lawfare is the waging of war, what I would call the war of delegitimization under the cover of law. As it happens, we meet at an important moment of remembrance and reminder of bearing witness and hopefully taking action with respect to this phenomenon of warfare. We meet, and it may be sometimes forgotten, on the 35th anniversary of the Zionism is Racism resolution. And I recall to you the words of the late Senator Daniel Moynihan at the time, which were really lawfare words, when he said that the Zionism is Racism resolution gave the abomination of anti-Semitism the appearance of international legal sanction. So in a way, this was the origins of international juridical expression under the protective cover of the United Nations of the phenomenon of warfare. We meet also on the eve of the 35th anniversary, and I want to speak about the convergence of these dynamics, of the origins of what might be called the international human rights revolution. The ratification then of the two international covenants on civil and political rights, social and economic and cultural rights, which form what has been referred to as the International Bill of Rights. The ratification of the optional protocol to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which gave individuals the right to petition the UN to become subjects of international law. The adoption, we may forget, but of the Helsinki Final Act, which was the centerpiece for the human rights revolution with respect to the Soviet Union and the struggle for Soviet Jewry in general. The immediate aftermath of the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which I had occasion to speak about just several days ago in Geneva on the occasion of International Women's Day. Indeed, interestingly enough, this was the 100th anniversary this year of the founding of International Women's Day. All of which, in effect, led Father Robert Drinan, then a professor at Georgetown Law School, to write a book on the history and hopes of the human rights revolution, where he spoke at the time, and this was a theme really of that book, that the elevation of human rights into an international juridical norm was, as he put it, the most dramatic development in contemporary jurisprudence. And he was factoring in these dynamics, as I mentioned. As a Canadian for whom the United Nations is part of our DNA, where international law is a centerpiece not only of our foreign policy, but very much, I would say, of our identity, I have been living through the two parallel processes, the international human rights revolution, and at the same time, the lawfare process, which was proceeding under the radar screen, developing incrementally without us paying all that much notice to it. Let me give you just one of many examples. At the same time as the Zionism is Racism resolution was adopted, and our focus on that, and which has since been repealed, another phenomenon was going on, and that is where through the mainstream, through the United Nations system, and as I say, I speak as someone for whom the UN is part of my DNA, you had a situation where Israel was portrayed as the enemy of all that is good and the repository of all that is evil. And so it was then that Israel was held to be the enemy of trade unionism. Evidence, the resolution of the International Labour Organization condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian trade unions. The enemy of health. Evidence, the resolutions of the World Health Organization condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian health. The enemy of culture, evidence the resolutions of UNESCO condemning Israeli desecration of historic sites, which has been revisited lately, as you may appreciate. The resolutions of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, which even was the forerunner and spoke of Zionism as racism even before the UN General Assembly took it up. It spoke of Israeli suppression of women's rights. The enemy of peace, with respect to Israel being a non-peace-loving nation, etc., again in these resolutions. So if you sum that up, and I'm taking just one snapshot, Israel, therefore, as the enemy of labor, of health, of culture, of women's rights, of human rights, and peace, was the enemy of all that is good, and with the more recent attribution to Israel of being an apartheid, if not Nazi state, then the repository of all that is evil. Let us not forget, in legal terms, in juridical terms, apartheid is defined as a crime against humanity. If you say that Israel is an apartheid state, it's not just a matter of idle rhetoric. What you are saying is it's a criminal state, and criminal states really have no right to be. And if you add to it that it's also a Nazi state, the call, therefore, for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state takes on a certain moral imperative. And then all those who are associated with that apartheid Nazi state are deemed to be themselves collaborators in that evil. Let me fast forward, and with this I'll start to move to close the second part of my remarks. Let me fast forward to the events of the last few weeks alone and to bring all this together. I was in Israel a month ago, where the buzzword, in fact, the buzz, was all about lawfare, delegitimization. Goldstone as a metaphor for both. You could not go anywhere without hearing about this, participating in forums involving this, and even where the government of Israel referred to lawfare in its expression of delegitimization as constituting a threat to the legitimacy of Israel. Mentioned even by the leaders of Israel in the same breath in a talk as they were speaking also about the existential threat of Iran. I returned to Canada, and for the beginning of our parliamentary session, we had been prorogued for 3 months, which allowed me to also go to Israel and elsewhere, but I won't go into that separate legal issue in Canadian terms. But outside the parliamentary bubble, there was the beginning, and Canada was the origin of this, of Israeli Apartheid Week, with all that that involves, and that has now become more of a global phenomenon. It isn't as it originally began, and I don't think Canada was accidentally chosen for it as a Canadian phenomenon. I returned this week to Geneva, and I participated in Monday at a summit on human rights, tolerance, and democracy in Geneva. At that summit, you had all the main, political prisoners, victims of human rights violations. That was the theme of it. All of whom bore witness, shared their narrative as victims of human rights violations, and indeed their lament that the human rights revolution of which I spoke was not, in fact, being exercised on their behalf. And right across the street was the reason in part why. Because the meetings of the UN Human Rights Council were taking place. And once again, one member state of the international community was being singled out for differential treatment and discrimination, almost an obsessive preoccupation of that member state that happens to be Israel. And no less important and sometimes forgotten, the real human rights violators, Iran, Sudan, China, were enjoying exculpatory immunity. Not one resolution against them. So 27 of the first 33 resolutions of the UN Human Rights Council held out when I was teaching the law as being, the source of the promotion and protection of international human rights. Look at textbooks on international human rights law. You'll see the jurisprudence of the UN Human Rights Council, and yet you see here the kind of pervasive denial, if I can use the term in juridical sense, of international due process to a member state of the United Nations.